The summer of 1887 arrived in the Arizona Territory without mercy. By June, the earth had split into jagged cracks, the rivers had shrunk into muddy ribbons, and the wind carried more dust than hope. Folks around Dry Creek stopped praying for rain because even their prayers seemed to vanish into the empty sky. On the edge of the valley, miles away from the nearest neighbor, stood a weather-beaten adobe cabin. Its faded walls leaned against years of scorching heat, and its roof sagged beneath countless desert storms. Inside lived Clara Bennett and her 7-year-old son, Sam. 8 months earlier, Clara's husband had died from a rattlesnake bite while repairing a broken fence on their small homestead. By the time help arrived, it had been too late. Since then, Clara had fought every day to keep the little ranch alive with nothing more than determination and stubborn pride. The garden had withered weeks ago. The chickens were gone. Their last mule had been traded for flour nearly a month earlier. Now only a handful of dried beans rested inside a cracked tin jar. Each evening, Clara climbed onto the porch and hung a lantern from an old wooden post. It wasn't just for light. Travelers crossing the desert had long used lonely lanterns as signs that someone still lived nearby. It was a silent promise that life remained in the endless wilderness. That evening, the lantern never burned. A fierce desert wind rose shortly after sunset. By midnight, it had become one of the worst sandstorms anyone could remember. The sky disappeared beneath walls of swirling dust. The cabin groaned as sand slammed against its walls like crashing waves. Inside, Clara held Sam tightly beneath a worn blanket while the roof creaked above them. "It's going to pass," she whispered, though she no longer believed her own words. Another violent gust shook the cabin. A heavy roof beam cracked. Part of the ceiling collapsed, sending dirt and broken timber crashing onto the floor. The front door jammed beneath drifting sand. Every window disappeared behind mountains of dust. They were trapped. Sam buried his face against his mother's shoulder. "Are we going to die?" Clara closed her eyes. She wanted to tell him no. Instead, she simply wrapped both arms around him and prayed silently that if the Lord planned to take them, he would take her first. Nearly 3 miles away, rancher Elias Morgan finished locking the doors of his stable as the storm howled across the valley. He had lived alone since his wife passed away 3 years earlier, raising his 2 children while running the largest cattle ranch for 50 miles. Every evening, as naturally as checking his livestock, Elias glanced across the desert toward the lonely ridge where Clara's lantern usually flickered against the darkness. Tonight, there was nothing. Only blackness. He frowned. The lantern had never failed before. Not once. Most men would have blamed the storm and returned inside. Elias couldn't. Something deep in his chest refused to let him ignore the silence. Within minutes, he saddled his strongest horse. His ranch hand called after him. "You'll never make it through that storm." Elias pulled his hat lower against the wind. "If someone out there still needs help." He tightened the reins. "Then I have to try." The ride felt endless. The horse fought every step through dunes that hadn't existed hours before. Sand stung Elias's face like flying needles, and more than once he nearly lost sight of the trail entirely. Finally, a familiar shape emerged through the swirling dust. Clara's cabin. Half buried. The porch had vanished beneath towering drifts. No light. No sound. Elias leaped from the saddle and forced his way to the blocked front door. It wouldn't move. He grabbed a heavy fence post lying nearby and slammed it against the wooden frame. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the door splintered inward. A wave of hot, dusty air rushed out. Inside the dim cabin, barely visible beneath broken beams and drifting sand, Clara lay curled around Sam, both motionless except for the faint rise and fall of their breathing. For one terrifying heartbeat, Elias feared he had arrived too late. Clara and Sam stayed at the Morgan Ranch far longer than either of them expected. The doctor had warned Elias that another journey across the desert too soon could easily finish what the storm had started. Clara protested every morning for nearly a week, insisting she was strong enough to leave. Elias answered the same way each time. "You can go when you're healthy enough to choose it," he said. "Not because your pride tells you to." There was never anger in his voice. Only quiet certainty. Eventually Clara stopped arguing. Instead, she looked for ways to earn her place beneath his roof. One afternoon she wandered into the old equipment shed behind the barn. Saddles hung from wooden pegs, their leather cracked by years beneath the Arizona sun. Harnesses were stiff, reins had begun to split, and boots sat in dusty piles waiting for repairs no one had found time to make. Elias laughed softly when he noticed her studying them. "I'm afraid they're beyond saving." Clara picked up an old saddle and ran her fingers over the dry leather. "No," she replied. They've simply been forgotten. The next morning she borrowed a few simple tools, a pot of leather oil, heavy thread, and an old stitching awl. Hour after hour she worked beneath the shade of the porch. She cleaned every piece by hand. She softened leather hardened by years of dust. She stitched torn seams so neatly they almost disappeared. She replaced broken straps using scraps that most people would have thrown away. By sunset, the first saddle looked almost new. Even Elias paused when he saw it. "I've owned that saddle 15 years, he admitted. "I don't remember it ever looking this good." Clara smiled faintly. Good leather deserves another chance. Word spread faster than either of them expected. A rancher from the next valley arrived carrying 2 broken bridles. Then another brought worn-out boots. Within weeks, wagons rolled into the Morgan ranch with piles of weathered saddles and harnesses. Everyone wanted the widow whose hands could bring dead leather back to life. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara earned money that belonged entirely to her. She accepted every coin with quiet gratitude, not because she wanted wealth, because every payment reminded her she could still build a future with her own hands. Life inside the ranch slowly changed as well. Elias's children had spent years living inside their grief. 10-year-old Ben rarely smiled anymore. He buried himself in chores, speaking only when necessary. 8-year-old Lucy still left flowers beside her mother's grave every Sunday. The house had been silent for so long that silence had begun to feel permanent. Clara never tried replacing their mother. She simply filled the empty spaces kindness had left behind. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. Laughter slowly returned during supper. Sam and Lucy chased each other through the yard while Ben pretended not to enjoy joining them. One rainy afternoon, Lucy led Clara into the old storage room. "My mama's saddle is in there." The little girl's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Daddy won't touch it." Covered beneath years of dust rested a beautiful riding saddle, its leather cracked beyond recognition. It had belonged to Elias's late wife, Margaret. No one had used it since the day she died. That evening Clara asked Elias quietly, "May I try restoring it?" He stared at the saddle for a long moment. "I couldn't throw it away," he admitted. "But I couldn't bear looking at it either." He nodded once. "If anyone can save it, it's you." For nearly 2 weeks Clara worked in silence. She repaired every torn stitch. She replaced broken straps with leather carefully matched to the original. She polished every buckle until it reflected the afternoon sun. When she finally carried the restored saddle into the barn, Ben and Lucy stopped in their tracks. For a moment neither child spoke. Lucy reached out with trembling fingers and touched the smooth leather. "It still smells like Mama," she whispered. Ben lowered his head, fighting tears he had hidden for years. Elias stood quietly beside them, unable to find words. The woman the town barely knew had returned something he believed grief had stolen forever. But while warmth slowly filled the Morgan ranch, whispers began spreading through Dry Creek. Some neighbors admired Elias's kindness. Others whispered behind closed doors. A widower, a young widow, living beneath the same roof. Before long, those whispers reached the ears of Reverend Caleb Mercer, a man who believed appearances mattered more than compassion. Standing outside the church one Sunday morning, he watched the Morgan family ride into town together. His expression hardened. "This," he murmured quietly, "cannot be allowed to continue." Neither Elias nor Clara knew it yet. But the greatest storm they would face had nothing to do with the desert. It was coming from the town itself. The rumors reached every corner of Dry Creek long before Clara ever heard them herself. Some people claimed she had planned the whole thing from the beginning. Others insisted no respectable widow should spend months beneath a widower's roof, no matter the reason. Every retelling drifted farther from the truth. Only a handful of people remembered the sandstorm that had nearly claimed 2 lives. The rest remembered only appearances. At the center of the growing criticism stood Reverend Caleb Mercer. For years, the people of Dry Creek had respected his stern voice and unwavering opinions. To him, rules were simple, and anything that invited gossip threatened the moral order of the town. One Sunday after church, he announced that the matter could no longer be ignored. A town meeting would be held the following evening. Everyone was expected to attend. The meeting hall overflowed before sunset. Ranchers filled the wooden benches. Store owners stood along the walls. Even travelers passing through the valley stayed to listen. Clara sat quietly beside Elias near the back of the room. Sam rested beside Lucy and Ben, sensing the tension without fully understanding it. Reverend Mercer stepped forward. "My friends," he began, "our community has always valued honor, family, and proper example." Several heads nodded. He continued. A young widow has lived for months inside the home of an unmarried man. Whatever excuse may be offered, such an arrangement invites scandal. If we ignore it today, what lesson do we leave for tomorrow? A murmur spread across the room. Mercer folded his hands. I believe Miss Clara Bennett should leave this community before greater harm is done. Silence settled over the hall. Then Elias slowly stood. He removed his hat. His voice remained calm. The Reverend told you where Clara has been living. He paused. But he forgot to tell you why. Every eye turned toward him. The night of the great sandstorm, I looked toward her cabin. There was no lantern. I rode through a desert that most men refused to cross. When I broke down her door, I found Clara and her little boy buried beneath a fallen roof. They had no food. No water. No way out. The doctor later told me they wouldn't have survived until morning. His gaze moved slowly across the room. Tell me honestly. Which one of you came looking? No one answered. You speak now because saving 2 lives created uncomfortable gossip. He shook his head gently. I'd rather answer for kindness than for standing safely inside my own house while neighbors died alone. The room fell completely silent. Then Clara rose to her feet. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice never did. When my husband died, she said softly, I believed asking for help meant giving up the last piece of dignity I had left. So I stayed silent. I kept pretending everything was fine. When the storm buried our home. She looked down at Sam. I truly believed my son and I would never see another sunrise. Tears filled several eyes around the room. Only one person noticed our light had disappeared. She turned toward Elias. He didn't ask what people might say. He simply came. She faced the crowd once more. If you choose to judge me for accepting the kindness that saved my child's life. She smiled sadly. I can live with that. But I hope none of you ever discover how lonely it feels when pride keeps you silent, and only one stranger decides you're worth searching for. For several long seconds nobody moved. Then an elderly rancher stood. I remember that storm, he said. My own boys wouldn't ride into it. Another woman rose. Mine wouldn't either. One by one voices filled the hall. Not against Clara. Against their own silence. Reverend Mercer realized the room had slipped beyond his control. Without another word, he quietly gathered his Bible and walked out alone. Weeks later, Clara's leatherwork became known across the Arizona territory. Orders arrived from neighboring counties. She rented a small workshop in Dry Creek and earned more than enough to support herself and Sam. For the first time since losing her husband, she no longer needed anyone's protection. That was exactly when Elias finally spoke. One warm evening beneath the towering cottonwood tree overlooking the ranch, he handed Clara a small silver ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I've waited, he said quietly. I wanted you to know you had every road open before I asked. You've built your own future. You don't need saving anymore. He smiled. But if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life building one together. Clara looked toward the house. Ben, Lucy, and Sam laughed together across the yard as the setting sun painted the desert gold. Months earlier, she had believed the desert would become her family's grave. Instead, it had led her here. She slipped the ring onto her finger. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. That autumn, the entire town gathered beneath the cottonwood trees for their wedding. Even those who had once whispered came carrying gifts instead of judgment. In the years that followed, travelers often stopped at the Morgan Ranch for water, shelter, and a warm meal before continuing across the desert. Whenever someone asked Elias why he never turned a stranger away, he would simply smile and glance toward the old lantern hanging on the porch. Because, he would say, sometimes the smallest light is all someone has left to guide another soul home.